Jaipur Literature Festival, and really wonderful to be in conversation with Sven Beckert, a historian who I have long found extremely interesting in print and now in person. We've just met this morning for the first time, and our starting point will be this huge, monumental, well, I would say history of a commodity, but it's actually a history of global history. There's a lot of economic history in there. There are approaches towards empire and slavery, and it's a book that pulls together numerous different threads, like some sort of huge creation in cloth. And what we're hoping to do is to speak quite widely using Empire of Cotton as our start point, and then in about the last 10 or 15 minutes, it'll turn into a discussion with you, the audience. So if I could start, Sven, by asking you to outline in brief for anyone in the audience who has not read Empire of Cotton, what were you trying to do in this book?
Right. Good morning. It's great to be here in Jaipur, and Patrick, it's great to be here on stage with you to debate Empire of Cotton. So Empire of Cotton is basically maybe three things. For one, it's an effort to tell the global history of cotton as it unfolded in the past 5,000 years, though it does emphasize the history of cotton in the past, let's say, 300 years, from about 1700 to the year 2000, because the argument of Empire of Cotton is that cotton is not just an endlessly fascinating commodity, but cotton is also quite crucial to the development of capitalism. So the second reason of why I embarked upon writing this book is because looking at this commodity, looking at the history of cotton, is a way to understand important themes about the history of capitalism. Not everything about capitalism, but important things about the history of capitalism. And last but not least, I'm looking at cotton because it is a way to, by looking at a commodity, I can transcend the way we usually write history, namely focusing on regions or cities or national histories, and instead look at history from a truly global perspective.
And one thing that you mention is what the world might look like without cotton.
Right, so this is probably something that doesn't need to be explained in great detail here in India, but obviously cotton is not just important to human manufacturing activities. Indeed, producing cotton textiles was probably the single most important human manufacturing activity from about the year 1000 to the year 1900. But cotton is also really important to our daily lives, right? So when you make coffee in the morning, you use a filter that is made out of cotton. At least until very recently, most banknotes with which you paid were made out of cotton fiber. And then, of course, much of what you wear right now is presumably, especially in India, is presumably made out of cotton. So cotton surrounds us. Cotton is everywhere. We live with cotton every day, but most people in the world never really think about how this plentiful cotton comes about and how this has historically been developed. In some ways, cotton is like the air we breathe. You know, we need it, we must have it, but we don't think very much about where it comes from. And Empire of Cotton is an effort to understand how this very large and very complicated and very complex industry came into being, and what role it has played in the development of capitalism, and also what role it has played in the great economic inequalities that have characterized the world in the past 200 or 300 years.
So if you look at the early stages of the Industrial Revolution, the importance of cotton as manufacture, the development of chattel slavery in the Americas and in the West Indies, how does that fit together with cotton as it was pre-Industrial Revolution?
Right, so in a way, I'm trying to answer a great puzzle. As you know, cotton was crucial and at the very core of the unfolding of the Industrial Revolution in Europe in the late 18th and early 19th century. But as you also know, cotton was rather marginal to the European economies for a very long time. Indeed, Europeans didn't really produce much in terms of cotton fabrics until the 18th century. But there's another part of the world, namely right here, which was the world leader in the production of cotton textiles for centuries or even maybe millennia, and not just for domestic consumption, but also for global trade.
And this was happening where? In sort of northwest India or
In
across
Western India and Bengal, really,
East India.
Yeah, this was pretty much the case all over the South Asian continent. And the puzzle is, how come that Europe comes to play such an important role in the global cotton industry by the 19th century, and how come that cotton is so crucial to the Industrial Revolution, and thus to the great divergence, and thus to the great inequalities that would characterize the world beginning in the 19th century. And the way how I'm explaining that great divergence is that, that Europeans inserted themselves into the global cotton networks way before they ever played an important role in producing, manufacturing cotton fabrics. And they did so by violently expanding their trade into Asia, by capturing territories in the Americas that would eventually lend themselves to the production of raw cotton for European consumption. And third, by capturing the labor on the African continent, enslaving workers that would later come to produce cotton for European productions. And this is all happening before the technical innovations of the Industrial Revolution.
Mm-hmm. But when you have that being developed in close connection with the creation of chattel slavery and this kind of new form of slavery where, if you go back, people were using English property law as the basis of owning another human being. That's very much bound up with what then turns into the Industrial Revolution, turns into, as you argue, the origins of global capitalism.
Right.
But what is happening in an Indian context at this time? Are people just going on growing cotton, trading cotton? Is it a separate story, let's say in the 17th century or the early 18th century?
I mean, in some ways, it is a separate story in that there is a vibrant cotton industry, growing cotton, spinning and weaving cottons, printing cottons in India that is mostly catering to domestic markets, and that industry is persisting through the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. But there's also an important export component to the Indian cotton industry, and in some ways, once European traders appear in South Asia, that demand for cotton increases, and in a way, there's more export production in South Asia in the wake of European expansion.
But in South Asia, where are people trading with pre-industrial revolution? Who is buying Indian cotton outside India or outside the subcontinent?
All over Southeast Asia, the east coast of Africa, the Middle East, but to some extent also in Europe. So there's already already 2,000 years ago, some cotton fabrics would move from South Asia into the European continent in very small quantities, but some of them.
Okay, so one of the things that you mentioned is the way that the manufacturers of Manchester in England are becoming a little nervous of the fact that you've got places like Charleston or like New York taking over this growing global trade in cotton. And what they request is for India to step in and fill the gap and produce the cotton.
Right.
Why does that not happen?
Right, so that's a really interesting question, and basically, so once the Industrial Revolution happens in Europe in the 1780s and North America, the demand for cotton, for raw cotton, increases tremendously. Almost all of that cotton then comes from the just born United States, which emerges in the late 18th century, and all of that cotton is grown by enslaved labor. But this, as you mentioned, makes some of these European manufacturers nervous because they understand that slavery is not necessarily a very stable system of production of cotton, and they think especially of the revolution in Saint-Domingue and modern-day Haiti, which shows that slavery as such is not particularly stable. And so they're trying to envision ways of how to secure raw cotton from areas of the world in which slave labor is not dominant. And they're beginning to look at the Indian subcontinent in the 1810s and 1820s. And there are efforts by the Manchester cotton manufacturers and also by the East India Company to produce more raw cotton for European markets in South Asia, and there is some export of raw cotton, but by and large these efforts fail, and they fail because much of the Indian countryside is still outside the reach of European colonial powers, and also because the problem is to mobilize labor. How do you get people to work on cotton plantations for the benefits of others? And this pretty much fails in the 1820s and 1830s, and Britain and continental Europe and the northern mills of the United States all remain dependent on slave-grown cotton for their industrial production.
All right, so when you get to the sort of, let's say, the early or middle part of the 19th century, slavery across the British Empire is in the process of being abolished. It goes through various different phases. You then get labor substitution with the beginning of the indenture system, people coming from India and other parts of the world to places like Fiji or coming to Trinidad, or the shift of labor in the wake of the abolition of slavery. How then does India become part of that story? Who works the cotton plantations once slavery has been abolished?
Right, so slavery is abolished in the United States in 1865 in the wake of the American Civil War, which lasted from 1861 to 1865. And with the end of slavery in the United States, suddenly there's great concern among cotton manufacturers all over Europe. Where is all that cotton going to come from if we can't force enslaved workers to grow it? And they're looking around the world to find places where they can secure that raw cotton, and they increasingly now, or they again focus on South Asia, and especially on India. At this point, they are able to secure much larger supplies of raw cotton from the South Asian subcontinent, because the colonial power in the 1860s and 1870s has been pushed much more into the Indian hinterland thanks to the railroads, thanks to the telegraphs, thanks to the administrative and bureaucratic structures of the colonial administration. And they're able now to, European cotton merchants are now able to connect to the growers of cotton in the Indian hinterland itself. So it's not plantation agriculture like in the United States. It's really small-scale farmers, peasants who grow cotton, which is then being purchased by Indian cotton merchants and then again purchased by European cotton merchants, but without the resort to slave labor. So what is crucial here is that the ability of European capital, of colonial states to insert themselves into the social relations in the Indian countryside, but then also in other parts of the world, such as in Egypt, and then also in the southern parts of the United States, has now reached such a degree that cotton can be secured without resorting to enslaving the cotton workers.
Okay, so then there are people like Dadabhai Naoroji or Gandhi who talk about the idea of the drain theory, which then became very influential in the later 19th century. Does the drain theory make sense within economic history as an idea? And do you want to just explain what it is also?
Right, so the idea is that basically the wealth of South Asia and other parts colonized by Europeans was drained in order to help Europe develop economically. And yes, I think there is a lot to that idea. I think it's hard to imagine the kind of peculiar economic development of the European continent without at the same time keeping in view what Europeans did in other parts of the world and how they did drain not just the wealth, but also, for example, the knowledge.
Can you give an example about the knowledge?
So, for example, Europeans didn't really know how to manufacture cottons. And what did they do in order to learn how to manufacture cottons? They traveled to South Asia, and they observed Indian artisans in how they produced cotton textiles. And they wrote these things down. They wrote beautiful books. They shipped them to places like Mulhouse in France, and they tried to copy these techniques. And it took them a very long time. I mean, European cotton manufacturers by the end of the 18th century are still, they know that the quality of their fabrics is not equal to those coming out of South Asia. But eventually they do succeed by the late 19th century.
And once the global trade really takes off and you have this sort of relationship between India, between the southern parts of the United States, other places like Egypt, which are relevant. How does the sort of the global trade, what we would now see as, let's say, global capitalism, even though at the time that phrase would not have been in use, how does that interconnect at the end of the 19th century?
The global trade
in cotton. I mean, at what point does it become genuinely global rather than a series of local, separate operations?
I think amazingly early.
Okay.
I think it's way before the 19th century. I think already, by the 18th century, if you look at the global cotton industry, and especially Europe's role within that global cotton industry, it does connect the Asian continent, both in terms of textile exports and the export of knowledge. It connects to Africa and to North and South America, and then, of course, to the European continent. So this is already in the 18th century, in 1750. This is an amazingly globally integrated industry. And in some ways, it's no less globally integrated than if you look at the manufacturing of computers today. Obviously some of the details are quite different, but generally this is a very global system, and I think therefore it can only be understood from a global perspective. I don't think you can understand, let's say, European industrialization in cottons without also looking at India, without also looking at Africa, without also looking at North America.
Mm-hmm. And what is the significance of the US Civil War in your story? I know that the responses to your book in the United States tended to be very focused on slavery, very focused on the Civil War, whereas obviously from India the story looks a little bit different. But why is the Civil War a critical part of your story?
Right. The Civil War is so critical in the story because that is the moment when slavery in the empire of cotton now pretty decisively comes to an end. What I mentioned earlier, the question is then, where's all this cotton going to come from that is essential to European industry? And then, new systems of labor to produce cotton in the global countryside do emerge. So this transition from slave labor to other forms of labor mobilization in the cotton industry it can be dated pretty precisely to 1865, and you can see kind of a fundamental shift in global capitalism at this particular moment in time, when it becomes much less dependent now on the work of enslaved Africans in the Americas.
So, one of the great things about writing a successful book that is both a popular hit and wins prizes is that you get always attacks on the book. That's always part of the kind of enjoyment of the success. And the critique of your book has come from broadly left and broadly right. There's been a Marxist argument that you're actually, Marx got it right and you got it wrong, or that maybe Polanyi influenced you rather than Marx. And then there's an argument that comes broadly from the right, which says, well, capitalism is about freedom, it's about individual freedom. Why are you saying it has to be bound up with slavery and with imperialism? Right. Have those critiques been useful? Have they led you on to new thinking? Or did you just think, well, they got it wrong?
I think they got it wrong, so... No, I still stand by my argument, but let me just say a few words about it. Why this is such a vibrant argument. So on the one side, as you mentioned, there is a kind of to my in my words, a slightly doctrinaire Marxist argument that equals the emergence of capitalism with the emergence of wage labor, and anything that is a system that is not dominated by wage labor is not really capitalism. And then, of course, there's the other argument that you just mentioned, that capitalism as such equals freedom, and therefore slavery cannot possibly be part of capitalism, or forms of coerced labor cannot possibly be part of capitalism, because clearly this is not freedom, and so it's not capitalism. But I think both of these, I disagree with both of these takes, partly because I think they make a crucial mistake in starting with certain assumptions of what capitalism is, instead of looking at how capitalism actually unfolded historically. And what my book is trying to do is not to think about the essence of capitalism or to think of capitalism in a kind of completely abstract way, but to think about capitalism historically and what I call in the book capitalism in action. how did capitalism actually unfold in the past 300 or 400 years? And when you look at that actual history, not the imagined history of capitalism, but the actual history of capitalism, you cannot fail but see that coercion, violence, colonialism, slavery played a crucial role in this history. Why do people in the West prefer not to remember that? Because it's not a nice history, and so, you know, it's hard to deny the historical realities of slavery. I mean, we know it happened. We know it was a very important part, for example, of the United States economy until 1865. Indeed, perhaps the most important part of the American economy. But by making the rhetorical move to say, okay, this all happened, yes, it was terrible, colonialism, yeah, that was terrible, but this is not really part of capitalism. This is not really part of European modernity or North American modernity. That's a way to kind of divide in a categorical way the present from this particular past. But I think this is a huge mistake, because the contemporary, the present, is not entirely, but partly, the European present, the North American present, is partly a result of a long history of coercion, colonialism, violence, and enslavement.
But then when you enter the period after the abolition of slavery, after the colonial era, once you get to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, does capitalism become theoretically acceptable in a way that it was not a century earlier?
I mean, for many, that's a good question. I think for many Europeans and North Americans, an economic system that was based on the coercion and enslavement and extreme exploitation of people who looked different than them was perfectly acceptable, you know, so they didn't see that as to be much of a problem. I mean, there were, of course, also others who very much fought for the end of slavery, for example, but as such, for many Europeans in the first half of the 19th century, this just seemed to be part of the natural order of things, right? People who lived in other parts of the world and who looked differently from them, they were, you know, made to work for the benefits of European industry, for example. But of course, then, as we know, capitalism shifts course, and as I explained earlier, the global empire of cotton, but with it also global capitalism, came to live without this dependence on enslaving agricultural workers on plantations. So you know, this is also important to keep in mind. Yes, there is in the history of capitalism, coercion, enslavement, colonialism, and all of it play a very important role. But this is not necessarily the essence of capitalism. Capitalism can also be based on wage labor, as it is in much of the world now, without the resort to enslaving the workers. So I mean, capitalism is constantly shifting. It takes on different forms, and historically it unfolded, I think, in important ways by resorting, connecting to these and to enslavement, colonialism, and all of it. But it can also, in the present, looks very different than the past. It's kind of a, you know, capitalism. I mean, my argument is capitalism is undogmatic. You know, it can connect to all kinds of different things.
To bring it back to an Indian context, do you think that Khadi and the idea that everybody should spin every day, was that essentially a form of propaganda, an aspect of the propaganda of the freedom movement, or was it a serious economic plan? Sorry, a supplementary question. What do you think today when you turn up outside IG Airport in Delhi and there's a giant charkha outside, this idea that kind of spinning in some way represents the soul of India?
Right. That's a great question, and of course you are much more expert in this than I am, so I need to be careful here what I'm going to say. But what I'm saying in Empire of Cotton is that, and what you know very well, is that the history of cotton, the history of the cotton industry, plays an important role in the Indian struggle for independence, and it does so for the obvious reason that the cotton industry was very important to the Indian economy before colonialism, and the kind of shifting position of India within this global empire of cotton seemed to symbolize everything that was wrong with colonialism. And thus the idea to kind of return to self-sufficiency and to return to the production of cotton textiles in households with kind of simple technology was ideologically very important to the struggle for Indian independence for all the reasons that you just mentioned. On the other hand, what also has to see that the Indian independence movement does connect to the modern textile sector that does emerge in India in the 1890s. And so there is a kind of, maybe contradiction is too strong a word, but there is a kind of tension between the ideological project that was symbolized by the things you just mentioned, and on the other hand, that the most modern sector of the Indian economy is really to be found in the textile industry, and the textile industry does become, also in a kind of material way, important to the Indian struggle for independence. And of course, the future of India was not to sit in front of the home and spin cotton on a cotton wheel, but the future of India was really much better symbolized by the modern cotton textile mills that had emerged as well.
So do you want to say a little more about that, the textile mill owners who at certain points in Gandhi's career funded him, helped to set up Sabarmati Ashram? They are incidentally the grandparents of the people who are now in the process of creating Ahmedabad University, where I am now. I mean, it's an extraordinary story where you have this money emerging from textiles, which then goes into the purchase of other forms of economic success in Western India, and almost 100 years later, you find it being used for this vision of education. But what tended to happen with the big textile, the big mill owners of the west of India, is that there came a point after independence where they were displaced by the rise of textile production in other parts of the world, particularly in East Asia. And in most cases, those mill-owning businesses, those mill-owning families, they went out, the mills were converted into something else, and they got swept aside by a new phase of global capitalism.
Right. Yes, but they were still, as you just mentioned, they were still quite important to a particular moment in the history of the development of Indian capitalism, and they actually remain quite important even after independence. And I think what is important here to see is, now many people run around the world being completely puzzled by the economic rise of places like China or India and other parts of the world. And what I would argue is that maybe this are not so surprising, because there are long traditions of trade, of entrepreneurship, of capitalism in these parts of the world, including in India. And in some ways, this is perhaps symbolized by the rise of modern industry in places like Ahmedabad in the second half of the 19th century, and then in the 20th century. And yes, there is, this is the very nature of capitalism, that it's a kind of state of constant revolution. And yeah, the cotton industry is important at a certain moment of Indian industrialization, but it's much less important, let's say, today. And in that way, India is broadly similar, let's say, to the United States or France or other parts of the world. But I think what you can see there is a kind of long tradition of entrepreneurship, and I think this is the way also to best understand the contemporary moment in Indian economic development.
But if you were to take your commodity cotton into the 21st century, in most cases it's other places, it's not India that's manufacturing the garments. You have this situation where Bangladesh, for example, is a lot more successful in its garment export. So where has the story of cotton as a global commodity ended up in the 21st century?
I mean, now the world's most important grower of cotton, the world's most important place where cotton is spun, and the world's most important place where cotton is woven into cloth is clearly China. And when it comes to the production of apparel, it's Bangladesh, Vietnam, but now also some parts of Africa are becoming really important in this story. And basically, since the textile industry is such a globally integrated industry, it's a kind of constant race to the bottom. It's kind of a constant search for cheap labor.
I see. So it's cheap labor plus the ability to manufacture and export easily.
Right, and then partly it's preferential trade agreements that allow, let's say, Bangladesh to more easily export than some other parts of the world to European and North American markets. So this industry has kind of, there was a kind of whirlwind tour of this industry around the world to wherever labor was cheaper. I think we probably have reached now the end of that because short of leaving planet Earth, there's no other place to go. So then that probably will have some kind of implications for the long history of capitalism, that there's just nowhere else to go now.
Well, there is Brexit.
Yeah.
For those who want to exit planet Earth,
right,
and go into a new theoretical economic realm.
Right.
Is empire coterminous with capitalism? I know you're now working on a history of global capitalism.
Yes and no. I think historically, yes. As I mentioned earlier, if you look at the actual history of capitalism, you see that imperialism, colonialism, empire have played a very crucial role for all kinds of reasons. As I mentioned, from the question of the transfer of knowledge to the question of the transfer of resources. Is empire as such an essential ingredient of capitalism? Perhaps not, because the obviously global capitalism developed tremendously since the great age of decolonization in the mid 20th century. So again, I think I'm a little, I don't think it's a very fruitful way to think about capitalism by just as such attaching, let's say, empire or slavery or something to capitalism as such. I think it's much more fruitful to look at capitalism as it actually developed, as it historically developed. Of course, I'm not an economist, I'm a historian, and so I'm drawn to historical arguments. But that said, I think also on a kind of more general level, capitalism it can only be understood from a historical perspective.
So, I mean, for your new book on the history of capitalism, what then would be your starting point? Where would you begin? Geographically and in terms of what moment in time?
Okay, it's always it's always dangerous to talk about something that hasn't quite yet happened, and I'm generally reluctant to talk about the future, including the future of my own writing. But I've began to write kind of the early chapters in the history of capitalism, and indeed the very first chapter of the book starts in Surat in South Asia, and the idea here is that if you look at the world as a whole, you see in the 16th century, in the 17th century, you see many parts of the world that experience a moment of intensified trade. There are more merchants, they trade with more places, and they trade more things. Usually that story is being told, as many of you know, by looking at maybe, at the city of Amsterdam or the city of Florence or maybe London and other such places. But when you look at the world as a whole, if you don't come with Eurocentric assumptions to this problem in the first place, you will see that this intensified trade is happening in many parts of the world, including one of the concentrations of this intensified trade is on the South Asian continent. And so I'm beginning that story in Surat. And later, of course, I also talk, for example, about the city of Amsterdam, which I then introduced in the book as Europe's Surat, instead of the other way around, Surat as the Amsterdam of South Asia. To my view, this is a world of amazing resemblances. And I try to emphasize these resemblances for the 15th, 16th, and 17th century, to then try to explain of why this world in which traders, merchants, but also manufacturers in many different parts of the world who are, approximately, roughly doing the same thing, how does that then become a word that is so radically unequal in the 19th century, right? This great divergence really is fully unfolding only in the 19th century and then the 20th century. But then also trying to explain how the world is changing again today, right? Namely that when we understand, for example, merchants in South Asia or China or even Africa in the 16th and 17th century, I think we have a much easier time than explaining why this world again is changing today.
Wow. So how should global history be taught?
This is a good question, and it's in some way. a lot happened in the world in the past 500 years, and of course it's almost impossible to kind of keep all of this in view at the same time and teach all of that at the same time. And obviously what most of us have done is we have started to teach history or write history basically from a national perspective, right? We have come to grapple with the particular histories of particular places. And I'm not opposed to this. I think this is a good thing and a lot can be learned by doing this. But as I just tried to explain, I think you cannot understand very important things about the history of the world by just looking at these national contexts. You need to go beyond them. You need to look at this from a global perspective as well. And ironically, though, I think one way, and this goes back to your question, of one way of doing this is by looking at history, by looking at the global from a local perspective, right? So you can look at one particular city, for example, and write the history of that city not as just a self-contained unit that can be explained out of itself, but as part of a network of connections that go to all different parts of the world. So your city, for example, Ahmedabad, is, for a long time is linked to Europe, to East Africa, to Southeast Asia, to many different parts of the world. So in a way, by just looking at this one place, you can potentially write a very, 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 very global history.
Because, interestingly, one of the reasons for the demand in India for a new kind of higher education is the fact that a lot of industries are being transformed so quickly by technological change. So if you think of cotton, you think of textiles, you think of the fact that you can have customized garments coming out of one end of a machine by programming it in a particular way, all of the sort of the financial models that underlie the textile industry of a decade ago are starting to be dispersed. What are robots, if you like, going to do to the textile trade? Is the whole idea of the production of garments, the picking and manufacture of cotton, is that going to be changing because of robotics in the course of the next decade, 2 decades?
I'm always reluctant to predict the future, and yes, that this might happen, but the fact of the matter is that there are estimates now that today in the world, still 350 million people are engaged in some aspect of the world's cotton industry. Growing cotton, manufacturing cottons, that's a very large share of the world's population. So it's not like that this suddenly has become an industry that nobody is working in anymore. So I'm a little suspicious of kind of predictions that the labor is going to disappear out of this industry completely. But nothing is impossible. If you look at spinning today, obviously, it doesn't need very many people to operate these modern spinning machines that produce a huge amount of thread. So there's a huge productivity gain in that industry. But in Uzbekistan, it's still children who harvest the cotton without any kind of mechanical aids.
And to shift a little to the United States, which has perhaps been a bit neglected in this conversation so far, I remember being very struck in Mississippi when I visited there about 10, 15 years ago by the way that sort of the legacy of cotton growing is still very visible. For example, there are very large incarceration areas, like huge prisons really, where all of the surrounding countryside is cotton. So can you just say a little about how you go from the 19th to the 21st century physically in the context of the US?
Right, so the legacy of that history, the legacy of enslaved labor in the southern United States producing cotton for world markets is still very much with us. And the prisons that you just mentioned is an important point, because what happened after the American Civil War, when slavery came to an end in 1865, one of the ways how labor was mobilized in the American South to produce cotton for world markets was by using imprisoned labor and having prisoners work on cotton plantations. So there is a direct continuity from the history of enslavement to the mass incarceration of African Americans, and some of them then their labor being used for the production of cotton. But this is important, but I think what's more important is the fact that the vast inequalities and the deep-seated racism that comes out of the slavery history, that this legacy is still very much with us in the United States. And it's with us in the sense that, in a kind of ideological sense of discrimination and racism and all of it, but it's also with us in the sense of the material legacy of this history, because the fact of the matter is that African Americans, for many generations, worked without being paid for it and without having the ability to accumulate property or to accumulate capital. And that history, even though it's 150 years in the past now, 170 years in the past now, is still a history that is having an impact on the structure of inequality in American society today. And on top of that comes all of that discrimination and racism and mass incarceration that also has an impact on patterns of inequality today. So this is just to say that the history, and presumably this also applies to the history of colonialism, this history is not really over. This is not just a past. This is not just something that we should be caring about as historians, but it's very much a history that influences our contemporary politics and our contemporary patterns of inequality. And I don't think we can move beyond that history. We cannot create a world that tries to address some of these past injustices without facing this history, right? We need to first, I think, come to terms with this history and understand these patterns of violence, coercion, exploitation, and discrimination, and in order to be able then perhaps build on those foundations a world that is quite different in the contemporary sense.
Okay, so history is not even past. We've got about 15, 20 minutes left, and it would be really nice to have questions from the audience. We've got, I think, 3 different microphones. We're very keen to hear from any students who are here, so feel free to ask. Yeah, so maybe you'd like to start. Okay, and please introduce yourself before you ask your question.
My name is Udita, and my question is, what made you choose to write about cotton?
Okay, let's take one more, and we'll do the 2 together. There's somebody a little behind you and across.
Hello, my name is Beverly. I'm from Australia, and you deal well with the social aspects of cotton growing. Do you also deal in your subsequent books with the environmental aspects of cotton growing?
Yes, that's a very good question. We hadn't even talked about the environmental consequence. We'll come to this side next.
Okay, shall I respond?
Please.
Okay, so these are great and very big questions. So just quickly, how I came to write about cotton. I'm a historian of the United States by training, and I study the 19th century. And when I thought about writing a new book, I wanted to write a book that embeds the history of the United States in a more global story, and also one that focuses on matters of economic history. And being a historian of the United States of the 19th century, I noticed that for the United States, cotton is really quite central to that particular moment in its history. And I also knew that cotton was very important to the history of the Industrial Revolution. And so I decided that in order to get at issues of global economic development, to get at issues of how the United States fits into these global economic developments, it was perhaps best to look at a commodity. Okay, so these questions can obviously be tackled from very different perspectives, but my idea was it is a way to understand the global connections is by focusing on a thing, on a commodity. And clearly, cotton is, for all kinds of reasons that I don't need to explain, is really important to the history of modernity, to the history of capitalism. And so I decided it should be cotton. At this point, I had no idea how global this history of cotton really is. And if I would have known it, I probably wouldn't have written the book, because it would have seemed too difficult. But it just seemed kind of a way to hold on to something in order to understand these rather sometimes abstract questions of global history, right? It gave me something real to focus on. Of course, this has the history of cotton has huge environmental implications. Cotton is today the most chemical intensive crop. So even though it comes across as natural, it can only be grown thanks to the deployment of vast amounts of chemicals, and of course it uses vast amounts of water, which had terrible environmental implications in places from the former Soviet Union, where a lot of water was drained out of the Baikal Sea in order to water the cotton plantations of Central Asia, and indeed almost drained the entire lake. But also in Arizona, where the ground is sinking because the groundwater is used to water cotton plantations. So the environmental implications are vast. Yeah.
Okay, we have a question here in the yeah.
It's a fascinating talk, but are you not
Please
viewing...
introduce yourself.
Sorry, my name is Venki Ramakrishnan.
Round of applause, please.
It's a fascinating talk, but I wonder whether you're viewing the whole of capitalism through the love of your subject of cotton, because it strikes me as a very Anglo-American view of capitalism, when in fact many countries in Europe developed capitalism without really being very dependent on cotton. For example, Germany, Switzerland, or Sweden. Which I'm not sure whether you're Swedish or not, but anyway. So the point is that there is an alternative view, which is that actually it's the freedom and the pursuit of knowledge which allowed new industries to develop, which allowed capitalism to flourish. So I want your views on that. Thank you.
What a question.
Yeah, okay, that's a great question. And unfortunately, I have bad news. I mean, I'm not Swedish. I don't know really very much about Swedish economic development. But if you look at continental Europe, just like the United Kingdom, just like the northern parts of the United States, industrialized first in cotton, okay, not in coal or iron production or electrical machinery or chemical industry, but in cotton. And even a country like Germany, which is principally known for its contribution to the second industrial revolution, namely the iron and steel industry, coal, chemical, electrical machinery, and all of it, even in the late 19th century, more people in Germany worked in the cotton industry than worked in the iron and steel industry. Okay? So this is a misconception. I had to learn this myself. I was myself very surprised. But the economic importance of cotton German industrialization begins in cotton, and cotton remains extremely important to German industrialization into the late 19th century. If you look at Switzerland, the same thing. Swiss industrialization starts in cotton. Cotton is extremely important to Swiss economic development to the late 19th century. And if you think about the modern Swiss economy, you think maybe of places like Novartis, pharmaceuticals, Roche, pharmaceuticals. How did they emerge? They emerge out of the industry linked to cotton, namely they produced the chemical dyes that were used in the late 19th century then to produce cotton fabrics. So I think wherever you look, whatever part of the world you look at, and you look at industrialization, at least let's say to the mid-20th century, every place industrialized first in cotton. Okay, so I think. And I didn't know that myself when I started writing this book, and in some ways, as I mentioned, I was surprised. So I think this is a really, really, this is really crucial to the historical development of capitalism. And then your second point, I mean, partly I already addressed this in this conversation. Of course, as I mentioned, capitalism is a kind of state of permanent revolution. Nothing ever is stable under capitalism, and the idea of stability under capitalism, I think, is a contradiction in terms. Exactly for the reasons that you also mentioned, namely that this is an economic system that produces a great deal of innovation. It produces, it uses new forms of knowledge to produce new kinds of things in new kinds of ways, and this is clearly crucial also to the history of capitalism. But when I look at capitalism historically, what I observe is that this is not all that there is to the history of capitalism. So Europeans, I don't think, were necessarily smarter or more inventive than people in other parts of the world, but there were certain kind of structural features that enabled them to become develop their economies in ways quite different from let's say Asian economies in the 18th and 19th centuries, and I think that has a lot to do with things that we don't like to see that much today, right? With namely the history of enslavement, colonialism, coercion, violent trade, and you know, when the East India Company or the VOC traded with Asia, you know, they were heavily armed, and this was not exactly an example of free enterprise, right? These were monopolies that were backed militarily by the state, that themselves took on state-like functions. I think this history shows very well that this is kind of a crucial part of capitalism as well. This doesn't deny the elements that you just mentioned. I think they are clearly important to the history of capitalism as well, and they are also being discussed in the book. But I think we need to keep both in view in order to understand the really existing capitalism, and not the, you know, imagined history of capitalism.
Do we have any questions from students? I think that we have one here, yeah, on the right-hand side. And then there's also a questioner just here. You had your hand up, sir. Yeah, there.
Hi, my name is Parth. The question I have for you is, do you think there are other fundamental underlying entities besides cotton which are explaining modern-day capitalism right now, perhaps computing power or technological abilities that countries possess?
Yes.
Okay,
So
let's take one additional question, yeah, from here. Oh.
My name is Sushil Premchand. I have a question for a professor of history that goes back to the 1860s. Could you link the blockade of the US to the fall of Richmond, to the impact on the Bombay cotton market and speculation?
yeah, okay, that's a great question. Presumably you know the answer, but just to
Property prices
just to
in
amplify
Bombay,
that,
yeah.
when
My great-grandfather went bankrupt almost as a result of that.
okay, but presumably first he made a lot of money before.
Always a historian. He has to go back to it.
Okay, but for those of you who don't know that story, in 1861, war begins between the slave-holding states of the American South and the non-slave-holding industrial states of the American North, the so-called American Civil War. Abraham Lincoln was the president, and in order to force British or European recognition of this new state, this secessionist state, the Confederacy, the Southern States of America, the Confederacy decided the best way to effect that is to disallow the exportation of cotton from the American South, because they figured Britain and France are so dependent on American cotton that if this cotton wouldn't be forthcoming, they would recognize the Confederacy and therefore would allow for the independence of the Confederate States. This didn't happen, as we know, but what did happen is that this cotton did not leave the Confederacy for 4 years. Cotton supplies in Europe diminished radically by as much as 90%. And so the price of cotton in European ports increased tremendously. And there was a huge expansion of export, approximately tripling of exports of cotton from especially Western India to Europe. And that led to a huge boom in the Bombay real estate market, which was the Western India's most important cotton ports. And then when in 1865, the Confederacy lost the war, and it was clear that cotton would be forthcoming again from the United States. Cotton prices fell not quite to where they were in 1861. They actually kind of slowly declined until the mid-1870s. But one of the results was that the cotton trade became much less profitable, and the cotton production much less profitable in Western India, and that led to the bankruptcy, for example, of your grandparents? No. Great-grandfather.
And then the question about another commodity such as, for example, data.
Yeah.
Who owns our data?
Yes, so I think you can look at the history of capitalism through the history of various kinds of commodities. And clearly, if you want to look at the history of the 21st century, or even if you want to look at the history of the 20th century, cotton might not be the best commodity to look at, because while it is still important, as I mentioned earlier, it is clearly not the crucial thing we do economically nowadays in the world. And So looking at, for the contemporary moment, I mean, you suggested looking at data, but maybe looking at the history of the semiconductor or other such things, that I think would be a better way to understand, or for the 20th century probably to look at the iron and steel industry would be a better way to understand these particular moments in the history of capitalism. So I'm not arguing that everything can be understood about capitalism by looking at the history of cotton. I'm just saying that a particularly crucial moment in the history of capitalism, namely the moment of industrial revolution, is best understood by looking at the history of cotton.
So I think we've got time for 2 more questions, one here on the end. Any more students or Nobel Prize winners who would like to ask a question? We prefer them as categories. So one here, and then there'll be one here. Oh, okay, so you, sir, and then the woman there.
Roddy Sale, could I ask you to explain the relative valuation of cotton translated into current currency over the last 300 years, so we can really understand how valuable it was and when did the price tail off?
Okay, so the value of cotton, and then one more question we'll take here.
Mine is not a question, just a little side comment. So one is the boom that, between India and America and cotton was also enabled by the fact that the Suez Canal was suddenly built at around that time, which made it technically possible to take all that cotton through quickly. The other side story is to come back to Venki's point about cotton not being the main thing in historical capitalism. So you had this big Indian Ocean trade, which was controlled by the Gujarati merchants, with the Omani sailors and sultans, which was doing pearls and spice and cotton and all sorts of other things. And interestingly, the money from that, a lot of that went to fund the slave trade in Africa, meaning the Portuguese gun runners and the Omani sultans banded together to just steal people away from their villages and sell them to the slave traders. So just a comment.
Yeah, so this is true, and in this trade that you mentioned last, cotton textiles actually also did play an important role because they were used to exchange, so these Gujarati merchants used cotton textiles to exchange them for slaves. I mean, they didn't literally capture the slaves themselves, but they traded with African merchants who would provide these slaves. And indeed, there were, to my knowledge, there were entire villages in India who specialized in the production of cotton textiles for these African markets, specifically for the slave trade. So this is true. And what was the first part? Okay, so this is a super complicated question because, as with any commodity, the price of the past 200 years, shifted a great deal. Let me just, and including today, the price of cotton obviously is constantly in flux. But let me just mention two moments. So 1791 was a moment when cotton prices rose quite dramatically because at this point, it was still Saint-Domingue, the present-day Haiti, that was the most important supplier of raw cotton to European factories. And with the revolution in Saint-Domingue, that supply dried up, and cotton prices shot up. And this was actually one of the reasons of why cotton became then, in the wake of the Saint-Domingue revolution, why cotton became so important to North American, United States agriculture. And another moment of very high cotton prices, for example, is what we mentioned earlier, was the moment of the American Civil War, the late 19th century, with agriculture being transformed in the United States, with cotton production being pushed into the western parts of the United States, like places especially like Texas, Oklahoma, Texas, but then also Arizona and California, the cotton price, but also pushed into other parts of the world like West India, Egypt, and also Central Asia, West Africa becomes beginning to be an important producer of cotton for European markets. This is a moment of very, very low cotton prices, the late 19th century, which leads to a lot of political turmoil. So, for example, this is the moment when farmers in the United States create the populist movement, which is the largest third-party movement in US history. And here, low cotton prices do play a very crucial role. So I don't think we can generalize about that. But what we can say is that in the 19th century, raw cotton and the export of cotton textiles from Britain was Britain's most important trade relationship. They were focused on the import of raw cotton and the export of manufactured cottons.
Well, thank you all very much for those comments and questions. I think we have cotton above us. There have also been some squirrels running back and forth across the Mughal tent, which have provided wonderful distraction for some of us. A huge round of applause, please, for Sven Beckert.
Thank you, thank you.
Thank you so much, Sven. Thanks so much, Patrick.